Hi, Illia. It's the first time that we speak. So just to give you a quick intro, I'm based in Beirut. I work for Reuters. At Reuters, I cover Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. And I've had some experience covering conflict in Syria, conflict in Iraq, and kind of post-conflict dynamics, sometimes in Yemen and in other places, and in Iraq and Syria. So you're in the middle of it. So you have a different perspective because you are right at the heart of it right now.
Yeah, I'm having quite a different experience, but I would say that if it wasn't for this war that we have, at least since 2022, I think I would be striving to be somewhere next to you right now because, yeah, we have a conflict since 2014 here in this country, but it was very different from the point of view of perspective, of intensity. So throughout my career in the previous years, I also tried to look for something else, something new in my working experience. So, for instance, I working to a small media outlet based in Ukraine. I also tried to get myself deployed somewhere else, such as Golan Heights, such as Palestinian Authority, such as Africa. So if it wasn't for the full-fledged invasion, I guess would be closer in our career, the things that we do for this. So yeah, as of now, I don't think after this big war in our country, to be honest, I'm not sure that I will be having enough strength and motivation to look for something else, yet another war conflict zone to cover after all this. So I don't know, but yeah, I'd say if it wasn't for this war, I'd say I envy your work, your career, because it's super interesting. Yeah, I found myself so excited, and I was so just over the top when I visited the Middle East, essentially the Middle East, at my own money. I had some sort of a training course, like short training course in Israel, but with my own money. I went to Palestine, to Golan Heights. I almost made it I saw Syria from the Golan Heights. So, of course, if you want to be among the world's top war reporters, of course, you almost inevitably end up in the Middle East and working there because there are so many stories and so many things that need to be discussed. So yeah, that's super interesting.
So you wanted to become a war correspondent, and then is it that war came to you first? Is that conflict started in 2014, and that's how it happened?
It's yes and no. It's yes and no because it's true that the war came to me, and war and in general historical events, they provide you with sort of a choice of if you want to be part of this and what kind of role you want to play in this regard. Back at 14, I was a student. Just a student. I was like 22 years old, and I lived in Mariupol, the very city. I was just a student, so it was different from what we have now. Right now, we have a full-fledged, hard conventional war. Back then, it was different, as you all remember. It was very different. So I was basically a civilian living in a chaotic city. The city was not controlled by the Ukrainian government for several months. And from inside, it was not ruled by anyone but pro-Russian militants that controlled the city center. So it was anarchy. And of course, we were in the spotlight. And since I was a student in international relations in a small city, provincial city in Ukraine, so there's not much hope for you to be someone bigger than, a student. So we wanted to talk to foreigners we were super excited when we had a chance to meet someone from foreign country visiting on the university. So when these historical events came, we were young. We wanted to participate in this Euromaidan revolution in our city and also in Kyiv. So you have to pick your role you want to engage. And since I wanted to participate in all these things, so I started talking to BBC, for instance. At the BBC website, you could just leave your email address so they could contact you if you are witnessing the events described in the articles. And they did contact me and talk to me about things that I was seeing in Mariupol in those days, and they persuaded me to go in live in the middle of the night on BBC radio. Still, they call me time after time, especially the Scottish service. So one step after another step, I somewhat made into this media world, especially English language media world. And after that, I was thinking about joining the military because we were patriotic, we were super excited about helping the military. We truly believed, and we still believe, the cause of Ukraine in this regard, even though we might be considered as someone not loyal to Ukraine since we are Russian speaking and from the east, but it's not true. But the military was never a choice for me because of a lot of health issues. So nonetheless, you want to be there. You need to be there. So there's a way for you to be there as a journalist. And you go there, you join a really small newspaper in my hometown, also in Donbass, just really close to Mariupol. And step by step, you look up and you end up in Kyiv. And it goes on and on and on. So this is how the career works in Ukraine. From the very bottom to and up and up and up and up and up. And please tell me your story. How do I become the Middle East correspondent? I must say that to many of my friends here in Ukraine, colleagues, friends, it would be a job of a dream to spend a couple of years reporting from somewhere in the Middle East. That's a dream job. So how do I do this?
I think we all find ourselves looking at everybody else's position and thinking like, oh, that's really cool. And I think it's because inherently the thing that really makes everybody a journalist is curiosity. So we always hear somebody else's experience and we thought, oh, I'm interested in doing that because it's something I haven't seen before. I don't know about it, so I want to do it. There's some parallels actually between your journey and mine. I had wanted to be a diplomat for a long time and thought that was going to be a really great way to see the world. And then with Lebanese roots, I was spending every summer in Lebanon, and one of the summers I was in the process of thinking about joining the foreign ministry, and I thought, okay, instead I'm going to do something a little bit more adventurous. And as I'm going through this process, I'm going to work for a bit as a correspondent in Lebanon. And that summer, I was hired by a local news website in Lebanon, and it was the summer of 2013, so it was 10 years ago. And there was the largest concentration of explosions in Beirut that had been happening at the time as a result of the spillover from the Syrian conflict into neighboring Lebanon. So there was maybe once a week, sometimes more than that, there would be a blast or some kind of violent incident in Lebanon. And I remember the first time I went to cover the aftermath of one of these explosions. It was a twin suicide attack at two mosques in Tripoli, which is in northern Lebanon, which is a northern city, Sunni majority city. There had been accusations that a lot of people there had been going to Syria to fight. And there was a really, really deadly set of explosions that happened at a mosque there. And I remember it was the first time that I saw body parts. I smelled what it smelled like to be in a place like that when there had been so much death. And I remember being really surprised that it didn't scare me. It was more that I really wanted to understand as much as I could about what led us to this moment. And that was the moment at which I think I realized that, I'm much more interested in being as close to the ground as possible. And sometimes diplomats, unfortunately, don't get that kind of exposure and don't get that kind of access. So that's been a really important driving force, I think, throughout my career. And I think that's why earlier when I was answering the question about media freedom, I think it's important. One of the things that I think about all the time is access, being able to be where the event is happening.
Mm-hmm.
And people often ask me if being a woman affects that. It never has. Sometimes it has in a good way, actually. Sometimes it gives access that you don't expect. But that's one thing that I've always really been keen on. It's just I want to be in the room. I want to be on the front line. I want to be as close to the event as I want to be in the hospital. I want to be as close to the event as possible. And I think that, as you said, during conflict, it's more important than ever to be able to have transparent, accurate, resourceful information out there for populations to read, whether it's the population that's going through the conflict or populations that are just interested in reading it. And I wanted to ask you, since you've been, since you were a student when the first kind of installment of this, I mean, it's a war that has been kind of happening maybe in episodes, over the last 10 years, longer. Do you find that it's getting harder and harder for you to report from those first days until now? Is it getting more difficult? Is it in some ways it's getting easier? And how is it getting more difficult or easier to become a war reporter?
It's definitely changing because you inevitably progress. You get more skills as you work on and on. You get more experience, and obviously you'll do very different things right now from things that you were doing like 5 years ago or 6 years ago. Obviously that's a progress, and I would say that back then it was easier for me to write because stories were simpler. I had less demands to the quality, to the essential nature of what I do. The plank, the bar was lower in general, naturally lower. That's what happens right now. So right now I can't file a story that is as similar to the level of quality that I had five years ago. That's not a story for me right now, of course. So it's more challenging, and the more you work, the farther you progress, the more demands you have to your knowledge, because being a reporter, especially being a war reporter, demands that you know everything about weapons, about events, about every single thing, and the information rolls on and on and on and on. New weapons, new tactics. You have to at least generally understand all those things. So learning never stops. My girlfriend, she's mad at me because I almost constantly watch videos on YouTube. I read Wikipedia. I check maps. So because you have to be learning. So that's difficult. But there's another aspect in this, is that I'm not saying that I'm getting a PTSD or something like that. I do not believe in that. Not in my current role. But especially if you work from your own country that is at war, of course you invest 150% of yourself to this, and you burn out. You inevitably burn out because you really, really want to engage everything into this. So there's a limit. There's a limit of human capacity to work that. So to me, the biggest challenge right now is just being extremely tired, but we are very far from the end of this. So yeah, you just burn out. So that's the biggest problem to me right now. I was
How
really
do you deal with it?
Huh?
How do you deal with it? How do you and your
I'm
colleagues?
not. I just complain all the time about this to my friends and all that. But yeah, sometimes I just try to listen to my friends who say that you have to distract from something, you have to do something else, go get your car and drive a bit, go get some fresh air. So go get some life in general. Stop being a no-lifer in this regard. But I'm not sure if that works, but in general, that works. Apart from all those things, we are super, super grateful to the Ukrainian militaries that in most of the Ukrainian territory, it's normal life. It's 80% of Ukraine is a very normal life. I live in Bucha, the city of the Russian massacre. It's absolutely peaceful. It's absolutely normal life. You wouldn't see any significant differences between pre-war Kyiv and what's happening right now. So the city is bustling. So that helps a lot. almost every day I think about, I compare what we had even in here in Bucha, in Kyiv a year ago, a little bit more than a year ago, when the Russian forces were just behind my windows here in Bucha, for instance, in this neighborhood. And here we are a year ago, absolutely normal life, and that helps. That helps a lot. But in general, there's too much work, way too much work for this. And we mentioned this in our conversation, is that being a journalist, especially a conflict journalist, demands you a special sort of personality. I don't know. That's not always rational from this regard. You mentioned the terror attacks, body parts, and you want to be there, not because you're a maniac or something, just because it takes you a special personality, because you want to be there, you want to be with these people, you want to be with these events, you have to process these events and tell other people about this. And it's not very easy to explain to other people. Who would want to be in those places? Absolutely no one. Who would want to be like in the first line with the Ukrainian military breaking through Bucha? Absolutely not a single sane person would want that. But we in Ukraine, here in Kyiv, we had foreigners, a lot, basically all of the world reporters, and they were just fighting, filling each other faces in for the chance to join the military and see that and go with that. So it's just the way we are. So, and this very special nature of our profession, it takes a lot of strength, of spiritual strength, as we call it in Ukraine. So yeah, that's super demandful from this regard. But you told me that something that I find really familiar, the gender problem, or not a problem, this speciality. If we talk about such things when it comes to war reporting in Ukraine, there's pros and cons of being both male and a female war reporter in the front line. Both genders have the something to work with, have the special abilities that can help or not help in this regard. A conventional thinking might tell you that as a male reporter, it's easier for you to get deployed with the combat unit and go there. But on the ground, in reality, it often happens that soldiers, combat units might be somewhat more emotionally invested into having a very stubborn girl by their side, a person which is very interesting, very inspiring in some regard, very emotionally interesting, very interesting. So girls at the front line, they do a lot of job, and they find their ways. They can work. I mean, I would say that half of the reporters that I know in Ukraine war are female, and they do not have problems. They have the same issues that we guys do, and there's equality in this, because in those parts people became truly equal, because and I wanted to ask you a question. Does it work in places like Middle East? Just tell me about this. How does it help or not help you?
Yeah, I think you're right that it provides an opening and an opportunity oftentimes to connect with people, often because if you're in a conflict zone, you will often encounter fighters that don't expect to see you there. And so, fighters who have been on a front line for 2 weeks or 3 weeks or a month or longer, they've seen basically the same faces and the same uniforms and the same routine kind of week after week after week. Suddenly they see somebody, first of all, who, I mean, since I haven't, thankfully yet, I have not had to cover conflict in Lebanon yet, but they see somebody who's coming from a different country. I've had people that just look at me and go, "What are you doing here?" We are so far from where I would imagine someone like you to be. So I think I think that shock factor can often just be the kind of icebreaker that you need with a soldier or with somebody who's on a front line. And I think you're right that often, you know, especially with, unfortunately, a lot of the younger fighters that I have seen in my time as a reporter, you know, whether it's in Iraq or whether it was in Syria, we spoke to a lot of fighters who were quite young, you know, who were either still, you know, below 20 years old or who were in their very, very early 20s. And with them in particular, you know, I feel like probably I reminded them of a sister, of a friend, of somebody who's, you know, somebody who's back home, somebody who they can actually speak to, and so they might open up, or they might just be more interested in speaking to me. And I think one of the things that has often helped me as well in these situations is that I'll ask a really, I think maybe it's my lack of knowledge about military equipment and hardware. So it's my kind of, you know, I'm coming as a very, you know, naive newcomer to the world that they're in, and just asking them about, what does that do? What is this? How do you use this? When do you use this? It just, again, gives them an opportunity just to tell me something really, really basic. I'm not going for the kind of hardcore information right from the get-go. What is your strategy to retake this area from ISIS? It's not necessarily that. It's something much more basic, and that's often led to a lot of really interesting stories. I mean, in Mosul, in 2016, it was the first time that we had seen the use of surveillance drones in urban warfare in that way in the Middle East. So you had Iraqi security forces and ISIS on the other side, both using these very, very small drones with cameras on them, flying them up into the air, taking a look at what's going on, having eyes on the front line in ways that they can't do with you know, with either whatever they've got up in the air or with their soldiers on the ground. And one of the stories I did was just about the really young guys that were operating these kind of surveillance drones. Basically, they were sitting on the top of this rooftop, and they had, you know, as if they're playing video games, and they have these little controls, and they're flying the drones, they're flying them back, and they spot a car bomb coming their way through this drone. So just starting a conversation about, you know, what are you doing? How long does the battery last? Oh, it's only 20 minutes. That seems like it's a really short amount of time to have up in the air to be able to see what's going on. And they would talk, and they would open up. And you know, in other situations, we get access to civilians that, especially in the Middle East, in more conservative societies in the Middle East, that male correspondents might not have had access to. So in particular, in the aftermath of the fighting against ISIS in Mosul and in Raqqa in Syria, a lot of the people that were fleeing, the civilians that were fleeing, were very, very conservative. The fact that they had been living under ISIS, and it doesn't necessarily mean they were supporters of ISIS, but in many cases they were simply religiously conservative, and the women were not ready at a time like that, having just fled, to speak to usually a foreign male reporter. So being a woman, and I think actually more importantly, speaking Arabic and being able to communicate with them directly, made such an enormous difference. And these are the kind of, you know, these are the soft skills that will make a story for you, being able to have those conversations in the language of the person you're interviewing, to get them to feel comfortable, to get them to relax, to get them just to express themselves the way they want to express themselves, is especially somebody who is that distressed, having fled, or having, you know, being expelled from their home, etc. Being able to speak to them in a way that soothes them is really exceptional, and I think one of the most important elements. So often when you know, a young journalist or somebody who's interested in being a journalist asks me, you know, what's your advice? And do not ask me for career advice, but what is your advice? The simplest thing that I can say is, if you know what region you want to be in, you have to learn the language, because that will just send you to places that you never imagined, and you won't be able to access unless you can speak the language. So that's a piece of advice that, you know, if anyone's looking for one, that's a free one there. But there's one thing I wanted to ask you about was, again, back to one of the earliest things that you said is how important it is to have freedom of information and a free flow of information during conflict. Have you found that war reporting can often distract from other important dynamics that need to be written about at the same time? So everybody wants to know about war and the front line and who's bombing who and how many were killed and the really devastating news that often gets produced out of war. But there are equally important things that are happening in the halls of power that don't have to do with conflict, or even socioeconomic dynamics that are playing out that are not directly related to the conflict. Is it difficult to find space to write about these things when you're expected to be writing about the kind of the boom boom and the really kinetic, violent parts of war?
The thing about the Ukrainian war is that it's not a total war, as Wikipedia would just define it. But like I said, almost any aspect about this country, about this nation, it works for the general purpose. It's so interconnected when you have such a large and such a demand in war. It's not a localized war, that demands you a pretty understandable amount of resources. It's about everything that you have. And it's so interconnected in so many aspects. For instance, it's so many seemingly not connected aspects. For instance, is there a connection between the military effort, the strength of the military, and judicial reform in Ukraine, for instance? There is a connection because the judicial reform depends, and it has an effect on the Ukrainian relations with NATO, with EU, with rapprochement, with more assistance, with chances of joining NATO. And what's even more important, the success of non-military, let's call it, reforms. It has a very serious impact on the perception of Ukraine out from beyond Ukraine by foreigners from foreign nations, on the image of Ukraine. Ukraine definitely needs to show the world that it's not becoming a failed nation. It's not really is, but it should be always showing the world that despite all the war efforts, we also keep the progressive reform coming. We're trying to fix the economy. We try to get this economy working. We try to make people continue with the businesses, paying taxes, create jobs. It's so interconnected. Down to the very question, equal rights in the military too, because it also helps. Same things go with, things like traffic regulation in this regard, the introduction of energy. We had a pretty hard winter when it comes to energy and electricity supplies and also running water. So there is a huge question about conserving the energy and finding alternative sources and creating the very alternative grid for importing the energy and also exporting the energy, because you have to keep the budget updated. So it's about everything, almost everything. Even culture, we have to support culture because we have to produce more content. We have to support, content creators that produce not only, something patriotic or something about war, but also kind of give people something different, something to distract on. Good music, plays, movies, YouTube channels, because people really need something else beside war. And I think we're making it so. And another aspect about this is that, at first it's everything about war, in the informational space, but the sort of a stabilization of this war with rules becoming more obvious and more understandable, there's a balance between non-military issues in media and the military. They kind of stabilize. They kind of find, and not everyone in Ukraine are really happy about this, because of course it's a nationwide war. It's a national war effort, but at the same time and again we have it on Facebook that some scandals erupt, like a YouTube blogger that pretended to be practicing psychiatrist ended up being a fraud. Massive scandal erupted on Facebook. He was kind of popular, even though I never heard about him. But it's a massive scandal, and many people not happy about this, saying that you are not thinking about the military, you are distracting your attention from this, but it's inevitable. People can't live 100% of the time in the war, so there appear other things. So naturally, society finds a balance between this, and it's a good thing. I would prefer that over the speedy exhaustion of society, like psychological exhaustion of society. I'm surprised that we're not war weary yet, but society finds this balance.
My next question, Illia, and this is born out of the kind of personal curiosity of how you've dealt with this, is that given the kind of surge of interest in Ukraine starting February of last year, you had been working as a journalist before that. You had been dealing with the challenges of a context that many of us have come to know only after the invasion, but you'd already been dealing with those challenges. And basically everybody wants to know about Ukraine, is looking for experts about Ukraine, is maybe becoming an expert about Ukraine overnight. And your Twitter following, I'm assuming, is probably surged. People who hadn't been following Ukraine now are all into it day in, day out. And if you're seen as one of the few independent resources for people who are seeking to learn about Ukraine, you kind of shoot into like rock star status overnight. So how are you able to maintain the level of work and the diligence when you've got a whole new set of pressures that come with that level of international attention that are looking at this conflict, maybe that they haven't been looking at it in this way before, and all of a sudden kind of the world's eyes are on these few Ukraine-based, I'm not talking about the international media that are flying in reporters into Ukraine, but Ukraine-based reporters that are there, that understand the context like no one else. How do you deal with that level, that like surge of international attention?
That's about thinking twice, or maybe 3 or 4 times before you say anything, before you tweet anything, because starting from February last year, many of us here in Ukraine ended up just found themselves being in the spotlight, in front of the world's eyes, literally. With us being like local reporters working in Ukraine, we had some followers, but back then it was really different. Right now you have to think twice, because there are things that you can say freely in Ukraine, and that would be absolutely okay. But there's a difference of the culture of speaking, of public speaking in different countries, especially in the West, and many people in the West might not understand what you mean, what you say, and given the fact that you are not a native speaker in English, so you have to think many times before you say anything. I'm not even saying about things like errors, factual errors, or something like emotional errors, because you are a journalist, you are a reporter, but you are a human being after all, and you are a Ukrainian human being, and you're prone to many emotional fallacies that can happen to you. You see something that is blistering on Telegram, something that gives you ecstatic joy from the Ukrainian victory, for instance, or something that might really impress your audience, and you are being emotional and you're posting this, and this ends up being something fake or not inaccurate, or you regret the wording sometimes. Of course, we're all humans, we can be ideal, but I think the rule is think twice before you say anything, because that might sound funny in your head, but on the paper, you might regret this. I had a couple of instances of that kind. I'm not proud of that, but we are all learning. We are trying to be distant in the eyes of the world, because it's true that many Ukrainian journalists, not necessarily Ukrainians, but also people who are connected to Ukraine. We have a huge foreign community living here. A lot of loyal loyal foreigners living in Ukraine. They also kind of represent Ukraine, and there is a sort of a responsibility because you are representing your country to the world, and you have to think before you go, onto international platforms, because you can say something for Ukrainian audience, and that would be more than acceptable, more than fine on the ethical standards. But if you talk to international audience, things might be different. So it's a sort of a special trait to talk to the world about things that might be different in Ukraine. So the answer is think twice, or 3 times, or 4 times. Think about what you do. So yeah. But what about safety? What about your safety in the Middle East? For instance,
safety?
Personal safety. Is there anything special that you should be thinking about as you work, for instance, on the Syrian border, for instance, or inside Syria? What's the special thing, apart from, very general things that we all know?
So safety means something really different, whether you are based in a place that might be teetering into conflict or whether you were being sent into a hostile zone like a front line. So I've been based in Baghdad and in Beirut, which are 2 cities that are out of, they have left the periods of active conflict that they've been in. So Beirut is no longer experiencing the civil war it experienced in the last century. Baghdad also doesn't have the daily explosions and the violence that we often associated with after the US invasion. But there are 2 cities where you often feel like things could it just needs one little push and it's going to fall into conflict. And in Lebanon a few weeks ago, we had an exchange of fire from Lebanese territory across the border south into Israel. Rockets were fired in that direction, and then on the way back, Israel also fired artillery shells and then some strikes overnight into Lebanese territory. And the risk with that event is that there's always a fear that something that is meant to be a singular incident that will take one day will just light the match, that will light the fire, that will light the war. So you're always afraid that something that is just a crack is going to start to widen into a bigger conflict. So that's the fear that I have in Lebanon, that I have when I was based in Iraq, is that you try to analyze. As a journalist, you're also playing the role of an analyst, always. You're always trying to calculate, okay, this statement by this armed group said this, which means that they might be willing to escalate, but the other side is not willing to escalate because of the dynamics in that country, and there's elections coming up, so maybe they are. So you start to think about every element that might be leading to something kind of escalating into something bigger. And based on that, you start to think about your safety and then the safety of your team. I'm managing a team of reporters here, and so I'm thinking about not just myself, but other reporters that are based across the country, in Lebanon, across Syria, etc., and thinking about what dynamics might be affecting their safety. When you're being sent into a conflict zone, it's a really much more limited, straightforward, tangible question of security. You're thinking the front line is that way, that's where danger is. You're not thinking about like back here necessarily up there. You kind of have a really tangible idea of where danger is and where safety is. If I go back to the 2nd or 3rd line, then I'm much safer than if I'm at the front line. And it's straightforward in that way. And when you're in a post-conflict city, you think about, is my phone being tapped? If I write this, am I going to get in trouble with this armed group or that armed group? So your concerns are much broader, much more nebulous, much more vague sometimes. And that's what feeds into the question of safety, based on, active conflict versus lingering, never quite post-conflict areas.
Do you think you'll spend the whole of your career doing this?
Oh, I don't know. I have no idea.
Why?
I don't know, because I think
Had a
it
very
depends
different
on.
impression. No?
Yeah, I think it depends on how much my curiosity. I think curiosity is such a nebulous thing. I mean, it can change one day to the next. Sometimes you just start diving into one thing, and that becomes a project that you work on for a year, and you never thought that this was going to be the thing that was going to take your life for that long. And then you're into something else, you're into something completely different. So I'm not sure if I'm going to be doing Middle East conflict-related reporting for the rest of my career, but I do know that the thing that has been consistent is that I feel the most invigorated and the most, I feel it makes the most sense when I'm closest to the ground. It doesn't necessarily have to be in the Middle East, but I think based on what I was saying earlier about how important language is, I think unless I pick up a new language, unless I take up, Spanish or Swahili or something else, then I need to go somewhere else. But for now, this is where it makes the most sense. What about you?
It's really hard to say because, life is a mystery, really. The whole life since 2014 showed us that life doesn't care about your plans and all those things. Life will bring you to something that you're destined for. I decided for myself that I think I will definitely be doing this thing until the very end of the war, until the final hour, because that's our duty to this country. And after that, I think I've had enough of this war things. This is what I'm thinking about right now, because I have seen way too much. I have heard way too much. I have known way too much about all those things. And it's not natural for a human being to be so involved, even emotionally, even when it comes to your everyday practice and mental activity into war-related things. It's not natural. You have to have something else besides, other than war and nothing but a war. And I'm not even a soldier. I'm just putting my brain into this. I'm not even fighting. So I think life deserves something else. I think I'll be doing something, maybe writing, but definitely not related to war. Maybe science. I enjoy so much when I had sort of a chance sometimes to talk about science and whales and oceans and all the stars. Maybe something of that kind. Even though I think we stand at the point at which we basically can be safe to say that Ukraine will prevail in this war in some form. It's pretty safe to say right now at this point. The question is when and under which conditions. So, but after the war, we'll be having a post-war period that would be extremely difficult and extremely challenging, and we'll be in need again. But we'll see. And like I said, all life is a mystery. It's really hard to plan something. We'll see what it brings us to when this thing is over. Let's see what happens then. But right now, I would wish to have something else.
I think and oftentimes once we get tired of war, we think we are more curious about what we were fighting for this whole time, and so then we start to go into into a lot of other bigger picture, longer term reporting, like science. But I mean, either way, I think anybody would be lucky to have your sensitivity and your attention to detail, and whether it's science reporting or whether it's conflict reporting or whatever it is. So good luck.
Yeah, thank you, and good luck to you too. I'm sure in this world we will all find a lot of things to do, because journalists, one of the things that the Ukrainian war has shown, that journalists are needed. Journalism is very necessary. It's helpful. It really works. Even in my town, Bucha. In many ways, Bucha was exposed to global attention. What we were seeing, Ukrainians, it was exposed to global attention thanks to global media and all the enthusiasm, all the presence. It really works. Without that, I guess Bucha would have been something among many other stories of that kind of Russian atrocities that basically end up being inside Ukraine and those very interested about Ukraine. Now, thanks to journalism, global journalism. It really works. So yeah, journalism will hopefully never die because it serves well. It really works. So there will be a lot of work to do.
Well said. Thank you, Illia. I think
Thank
we're
you.
done.